Greetings, everyone. It is again a pleasure to be able to do another lecture for CBSI, this time for 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For my lecture today, I would like to focus on verses 2 to 16 about head coverings. This is one of the most difficult passages to understand in 1 Corinthians, and is also mostly misinterpreted. And that is why I would like to give you further insights into this. Now, throughout our study of 1 Corinthians, we hear of this newfound freedom the Corinthians now have in Christ. And perhaps you are wondering, what is this new freedom that the Corinthians have heard that has gotten them, should I say, a little bit too excited? You see, in Galatians 3, verses 27-28, it gives us some insights into this new freedom that the Corinthians now have in Christ. Here we read that, "As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus." Richard Longenecker likens this statement of Paul to a Magna Carta Liberatum, or the Great Charter of Freedom for New Humanity. This statement of Paul tells of the freedom that we now have in Christ. You see, biblical scholars tell us that this is taken from an early baptismal confession of the early Christian community that Paul has adopted. This statement was recited as new Christians are being baptized. And so Christians know that new freedom that they now have in Christ, for they have heard of this when they got baptized. That there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female, for all are now one in Christ Jesus. Now, hearing this is something radical. Even up to today, when we hear this is so radical. And according to the scholar Otto Michael, he says that in the act of baptism, all distinction between men of the old eon with respect to nationality, salvation history, or social status have been done away. Now, can you imagine how people were feeling at that time when they heard this as they were being baptized? You see, this is the freedom that we now have in Christ, as in the new age that Christ has ushered in for us. If this is the case, then perhaps you are wondering, isn't Paul contradicting himself in his later letters, such as the book we are now studying in 1 Corinthians, and in other letters as well, such as Ephesians and 1 Timothy? If you look at Galatians, Paul tells us that there is neither male nor female, while in Paul's other letters, he tells us that the man is the head of the woman, women are to remain silent and be submissive to their husband. So is this a contradiction? While it may appear as a contradiction, it is not. This is because we still live in a broken world where the old ways of doing things are in tension with the new age we are now called to live. The new age has not yet reached its consummation, and because of this, we must still live our new identity and freedom in Christ in this broken world, where, let's face it, the cultural practices and norms make it hard for us to practice this freedom that we now have in Christ. At the same time, and I think this is very important, especially to the early church, we Christians now have a mission of bringing others to Christ. Because of this, Christians must be careful in practicing this freedom so as not to make others stumble or prevent any barriers for people to know Christ. Paul knows this, and this is what he is telling the Corinthians to do. We have seen this already in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and now we see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Remember, in 1 Corinthians 8, we learned that freedom should not be used to the detriment of our brothers and sisters in Christ whose faith are still weak. If freedom only leads to them stumbling from their faith, then it is better not to practice one's freedom. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, Paul tells the Corinthians that a woman's freedom should not be used to the detriment of the community of a family. If freedom only leads to bringing shame to the head of the family, then it is better not to practice your freedom. Now, to better understand this, we must know the context at the time Paul writes this letter. You see, the society back then was a shame and honor society whose structure is very hierarchical with men at the top. And let me read this. According to David Garland, he states that in this gender-divided shame and honors culture, the head of the family publicly symbolized the family's honor, and members of the family were to behave in public so as not to bring disgrace or dishonor to that person and the family's good name. How then does a woman contribute to the family's honor, and how can she maintain this honor? For this, I would like to read what R. Williams has to say. He states that it is through the strict maintenance of her sexual purity and personal integrity that a woman contributes to her family's honor. What's more, it is through the head covering a woman signifies her intent on guarding her purity. The wearing of a head covering is a declaration of the woman to society that she is demure, chaste, and modest, and that she intends to stay that way. And this is particularly important in Corinth, where the temple of Aphrodite is located. There is this extra emphasis on the need for women to wear a head covering so as not to associate themselves with the practices in the temple of Aphrodite. And so, through the wearing of a head covering, the woman maintains the honor of the head of the family, be it the father or the husband. And by maintaining the honor of the head of the family in a mutually interdependent way, the entire family's honor is maintained, including her own honor, the woman's honor. This is the significance of head covering for women. You know, in today's world, it may seem very trivial to us, but back then, the wearing of a head covering was very important to their society and to their culture. This leads us to the question, how then does Paul address this issue while still remaining true to what we now have in Christ? You know, the question back then was, what is proper? And that is also the name of the title of this lecture. What is proper? Paul tells us three things. First, do not dishonor the one who is preeminent. Second, instead be his glory. And lastly, men and women are to be mutually reliant on each other. Let us begin. Let us begin with the first part of the lecture, do not dishonor the one who is preeminent. In verse 3, Paul tells us, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. This tells us that we all have a head. You know, the head here signifies who is preeminent. The words, the man is the head of the woman, reflects the hierarchical structure of the culture back then, where man is higher than woman in their society. And while it may appear that Paul is adhering to the culture back then, it is far from his intention. By stating that Christ is the head of every man and that God is the head of Christ, in parallel with man is the head of the woman, Paul is presenting the bigger picture of our spiritual head. Though man is preeminent over woman culturally, ultimately Christ is the head of man. Thus, Christ is preeminent, the spiritual head of over man and woman. And in verses 4 to 6, Paul tells us that our actions have an implication for our head, or who is preeminent over us. Let me read to you verse 4 and 5. It says, "Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head." In these verses, Paul makes an argument from the culture at that time. As mentioned earlier, culturally back then, the wearing of a head covering maintains the honor of not only the head of the family, but the entire family, including the women's honor. And so by not wearing a head covering, it dishonors the head of the family and the entire family. One's action has an implication not only for a single person, but for something bigger and greater. Thus, the main point of verses 4 to 6 is for Christians not to dishonor their head or who is preeminent over them. And because Christ is preeminent over man and woman, this ultimately tells us not to shame Christ. Thus, in verse 6, it ends with a conclusion: have her cover her head. You see, this was the cultural right thing to do at that time, so as not to dishonor the one who is preeminent. And it ultimately points to all the way to Christ. We are not to bring dishonor to our spiritual head. Paul further argues, and this is the next point, no? Instead of bringing dishonor, we are to be his glory. We are to be the glory of the one who is preeminent over us. In verses 7 to 10, Paul makes an argument from creation. Paul tells us in verse 7, "For a man should not have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man." Here, Paul alludes to Genesis 1. For the man, Gordon Fee had this to say in this verse. Paul probably means that the existence of the one brings honor and praise to the other. By creating man in his own image, God set his own glory in man. Man therefore exists to God's praise and honor, and is to live in a relationship to God so as to be his glory. Wow, we are to be God's glory. Now, if we look at Genesis 1, the language there is more inclusive. Reading Genesis 1 verse 27, it says, "So God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." This means that both males and females are the image of God. Though not implied by Paul in his statement in 1 Corinthians, we can say that both man and woman are God's glory. And as the image of God on earth, man and woman are to reflect God's glory. Anything that tarnishes this glory goes against the very purpose humans are created on earth. Thus, we are to maintain God's glory in whatever way we can. We should be the pride and glory of God. Now, going back to verse 7a of our passage today, Paul highlights man as the image and glory of God. And in verse 7b, Paul then states, "But the woman is the glory of man." You see, what Paul is telling us here and what he is really highlighting is that the woman is related to a man, related to man as his glory. Much like humans are the pride and glory of God, a woman is the pride and glory of man. As such, the woman is to maintain this glory. And anything that would tarnish this glory would affect the glory of a man. And this is what is happening in Corinth. With some women not wearing a head covering, they were affecting the glory of their husband. Again, let me quote Gordon Fee on this. He states, "The implication is that by praying and prophesying in a way that apparently disregarded between the sexes, she brings shame on the man whose glory she is intended to be." With man being dishonored, their glory is tarnished. And with man as the image and glory of God, as highlighted by Paul here, what it means is that God's glory is also tarnished. You see, this is the bigger implication that Paul is trying to tell the Corinthians. And so, man and woman, instead of bringing this honor to the one who is preeminent, must be his glory. We are to be the glory of the one who is preeminent over us. And that ultimately points to God. In verses 8 to 9, Paul provides further arguments, this time from Genesis 2. In this passage, it tells of the order of creation of man first and then woman. This reflects the hierarchy of the culture in Corinth and even in the Jewish hierarchical structure. Thus, much like in Genesis 2, they are to follow this in order for men and women to be the glory of God. It is for God, it is not for us. I like to share what Fitzmyer had to say about the Old Testament way of the relation of a woman to a man to maintain this glory. He actually quotes from Septuagint of Proverbs 11 to 16, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but he translated in a way that it says, "A gracious wife brings glory to her husband." You see, a gracious wife can be not only become the glory of the husband, but it also brings glory to her husband. Now, does this mean that Paul is saying that man is superior to a woman? Is he contradicting himself and the early church with the baptismal formulas that there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Jesus Christ? Is he contradicting this? The next verses tells us that he is not. And verse 10 provides a transition to this. In verse 10 it says, "For this reason a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels." Now there is much debate regarding the meaning of this verse. But I would like to quote again Gordon Fee on this. He states, "To have authority in its ordinary sense of freedom or right to choose." Thus, verse 10 can be translated as, "For this reason, the woman ought to have the freedom over her head to do as she wishes." And so here, Paul affirms the woman's freedom to choose. No, he's not saying you have no freedom in Christ. There is now freedom in Christ. You have the freedom to choose. But much like in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, exercising one's freedom is sometimes not really the best alternative, especially if the consequence is dishonoring the one who is preeminent over you. In verses 11 to 12, Paul provides the qualifier to the freedom of women and at the same time the seeming subordination of women in verses 8 and 9. And this is my last point. My last point is man and woman are to be mutually reliant on each other. In verses 11 to 12, it says, "However, in the Lord neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originated from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God." In stating that woman is not independent of man, Paul qualifies the authority and freedom that the woman now has. The freedom of the woman should not be at the detriment of shaming or bringing dishonor to her husband. Yes, the woman has freedom, but it should not cause or it should not bring shame to the husband. Now, in stating man independent of woman, Paul qualifies the subordinate language of verses 7 to 9, where it states that woman was made from man and was created for the sake of man and for the glory of man. Again, Gordon Fee had this to say regarding this. While it is true that woman is man's glory, having been created for his sake, Paul now affirms that does not mean that women exist for man's purposes, as though some kind of subordinate position to his aims and will. To the contrary, God has arranged things that in the Lord, the one cannot exist without the other. Not meaning that every Christian man and woman must be married, but that as believers, man and woman are mutually dependent on each other. And so man and woman are to be a community. God created us to be in a community that mutually depend on each other. No man is an island, no woman is an island. We are to be in a community. Yes, there is now freedom in our new life in Christ, but this freedom should not be used for one's own benefit alone, but for the benefit of others as well. Yes, there is still a hierarchical structure in society, but this should not be used by the one who is at the top for his benefit alone, but for the benefit of others as well. Most importantly, in verse 12, it tells us that all things comes from God. Thus, we owe it to God. We all belong to God's community, and so we do things not for ourselves, not just for others, but we do things for God. It is for God. Now, in conclusion, I would also like to go through Paul's conclusion in verses 13 to 16. He asked the Corinthians to judge what is proper. In this part, he now turns to what society understands to be natural. And the expected answer at that point in time is for women to pray to God with her head covered. Today, that question of Paul can also be directed to us. Not so that the question is not for us, is it proper to wear head covering? But we can contextualize it today. In our church today, when we go to our worship service, what is proper for us to wear? What does our society today understand to be natural? For women today, much like before, they now have the freedom to wear what they deem is proper in their new life in Christ. And perhaps with our society being less hierarchical, we can even contextualize this today not only to women, but even to men as well, and even to our children. In our new life in Christ, we have this newfound freedom. But as we have learned in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, exercising one's freedom is not always the best thing to do. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, Paul tells us that we are to discern what is proper. And what is proper is that our appearance and our actions do not dishonor the one who is preeminent over us. Whether this is our parents, whether this is our husbands, whether this is even our grandparents, and most especially God. We are not to bring dishonor. Instead, what we are to do is to be the glory of those above us, most especially God. We are to be the glory of God. And we can do that through what we wear in church. This is because God created us to be a community that mutually upbuilds each other. You see, this is what is proper according to Paul and what we are to apply as well today. And so I will end my lecture with this. I hope you were able to have more insights in this difficult passage in our study of the Corinthians. And I hope that we can apply this today as well as we go to our church or even to our gatherings, that is where we are looked at not just as guests but as ambassadors of Christ. Again, I hope you were blessed. Thank you for allowing me to do this lecture again. God bless everyone.